Alright, so we're going to look at a tour of a version 2 gearbox today. This happens to be from a front-wired JGM4, and it's actually stock and never been opened. So one of the first things you want to do is you'll notice all this wonderful grease all over it. So we're going to wipe that down a bit just to keep it from being so disgusting. Many gun manufacturers, especially Cyclone companies, love to overlube. Some of them aren't as bad as they used to be, but still. Alright, so before we begin opening the gearbox, we're going to make sure we find the right part, and that it doesn't currently have, it hasn't been half cycled. So to do that, now some companies make anti-reversal latches with a little slit right there on the anti-reversal latch axle so that you can just use a flathead to do this, but most companies, JG included, doesn't do that. So we have this little tool here that's just a hook. We're going to reach in and grab the anti-reversal latch and pull it up. And this one was already discharged, so we're good. But in the case of you having something half cycled, the spring would be partially compressed, which would give you more pressure here, so it's be more likely to kind of pop everything out. So it's always good to trip that anti-reversal latch before you start taking it out to make sure it doesn't do that. And I'm going to go ahead and put this in the spring guide because that's going to help us later on. Start taking these screws out. If you want to remember where all of these go, just map them out. When you set them over to the side, set them out in the same pattern, the same shape as the gearbox itself. That way you'll remember where they go. Now these screws happen to be Torx. Most manufacturers use either Torx, Allen, or Phillips for the shell screws. Okay, so to open it up, keep pressure on the cylinder right here, because the cylinder is not part of the shell. It's going to stay down when everything else comes up. And then keep pressure right here so that the spring guide doesn't pop up and shoot out. You see how I'm pulling with my index finger and my thumb here. Sometimes you might have to push up here with the thumb too. And lift and pull that out. Now it's not under tension. The only other thing that's under tension that you really have to worry about is the tappet plate. You can just pop that out, pop it up there. So now that's not under tension. And this is the inside of a version 2 gearbox. Now most gearboxes are pretty much the same thing. They're just all shaped a little bit differently. So now for a tour of what exactly every part is and what it all does in a gearbox. The first thing that happens is you pull the trigger. And that pushes this little slide here forward to touch these two contacts. One's on the top and one's on the bottom. So you can't see that it's two, but when it does that, it makes an electrical connection that then sends electricity along these wires to the motor. And the motor sits in the pistol grip, since this is in an M4, and it sits right up in here. We'll take this spring out just so I can set it up there, and it makes contact right there. So when this spins, this is the pinion gear on the motor here, when that spins, it turns the bevel gear, which is this gear. The bevel gear, of course, acts on the spur gear, which is the center one here, which acts on the sector gear, which is the big one up here. So they all spin in tandem. Now this bevel gear is called that because these teeth here that mesh with the pinion are beveled. And these teeth on the bottom mesh with the bottom of the spur gear, and these teeth on the top of the spur gear mesh with the bottom teeth of the sector gear. Now, this is the anti-reversal latch. What it does is it catches these little spiral grooves to make sure that the whole thing doesn't cycle backwards. The reason for that is because if it cycled backwards, your sector gear will be slammed up against the back of the piston there, and you'd be at an impasse. So we'll take all these out. Now this right here and this are bushings. You can see in the other side of the shell where this sits, right there. That's where you want your high friction lubrication, because all that pressure and tension is in those bushings where the bevel and the spur and the sector spin. So we'll set that to the side. So now what happens when they start spinning is this comes around, and this right here pushes back the tappet plate. Now the tappet plate normally has this spring attached, which gives it forward pull, which is why it normally sits all the way forward. So when the sector gear pulls it back, the tappet plate comes back, and that pulls the air nozzle back. Now when the air nozzle comes back, the hop-up chamber, which is sitting right there, this is a two-piece, so this is sitting right here. When the air nozzle is pulled back, it allows a BB to feed up in front of it. And at the same time, the sector gear starts pulling the piston back. And I'll take the spring out just so it'll be easier to do. Oh, never mind, this kind's attached. So now we've got the piston moving back. The tappet plate's all the way back, so a BB is up in front of that air nozzle there. And the piston's about halfway back. So at this point, the tappet plate is going to come back forward, right about now. And it's going to come back forward again because this spring's attached, so it's got forward pressure. Now the air nozzle is all the way forward in the hop-up chamber, which would be sitting here. And once it's there, it's pushed the BB into the barrel right before it hits the bump on the bucking. And the air nozzle has formed a seal with the back of the bucking where the barrel is. So we have a round in the chamber ready to go. You can see this spring obviously isn't under the tension it would be under, but the spring guide sits up inside of the piston, and this whole spring at this point is very highly compressed. So we get further back, and right about here is where it releases, because this keeps going on its cycle. So now the pressure of that big mainspring takes over, and it forces the piston forward at a high rate of speed. And once it hits this point, it starts compressing the air. So all this air in here is getting compressed very quickly into a very small spot right behind the BB, and the BB fires out. And that's how gearboxes do what they do. And we'll show you a little bit more detail. Okay, and you can see how the tappet plate is not fixed to the air nozzle. The air nozzle simply sits in a little groove in the tappet plate. And there's a tappet plate spring. The spring guide we'll take out. Now that big screw that goes into the buffer tube actually screws into the inside of this spring guide here. Now this is your assembly. The whole piston cylinder assembly is where all the air compression happens. And this is where you want all your seals to be good. The cylinder is just that. It's nothing but a metal cylinder. Take out this cylinder head. Alright. You can see since this is an M4, it has a medium length barrel, so it doesn't need the entire volume of the cylinder, which is why it has a ported cylinder. And the cylinder head, of course, this O-ring provides a seal against the cylinder. You've got some sorbethane here that kind of dampens the pressure of this slapping into it, so it's less likely to crack the piston head or the cylinder head. You can add more of that, and we'll get to that later on in other videos. But the air nozzle sits right on this and slides back and forth. And that's why air nozzles with an internal O-ring, which this one doesn't have, are a good aftermarket part to get if you're ever doing any compression builds, because that helps a little bit with that seal. See, this is the piston head with the O-ring here, and that forms the main seal as it compresses the air. Now this is the old JG style where the spring locks in. So it's actually attached to a washer type thing inside of the body of the piston. And this head here is a separate part from the piston that you can remove and replace and upgrade as necessary. A couple other smaller parts in the gearbox that are a little lesser well known. This right here is acted upon by the selector plate on the opposite side, and when you put it in safe, it sits just like that so that you can't pull the trigger. So that's all that is. Underneath of the sector gear, you have the cutoff lever. And what this does is it makes your gun shoot in semi-auto when you want it to. When it's engaged, right now it's not, but I'm going to move the, okay, see, that would be safe. I'm pushing with my finger back here. I'm pushing the selector plate, which is what's acted upon in the lower receiver when you move the selector lever, or selector switch. So this would be safe. And that would be semi, and this is full auto. Now, as you can see in full auto, this cutoff lever just sits down here and does absolutely nothing. In semi-auto, the cutoff lever sits up here, and it will still move. There's a spring there, so it can, but it acts upon this little part right here to slow it down after you've fired a single round. So when this spins, then I can feel right now, I can feel it hitting that cutoff lever. So it adds that pressure so that it'll stop after firing a round so that you can have semi-auto. Now this is one part of the gearbox that you don't want a bunch of lube on, is between that part and the cutoff lever, because that works entirely on friction. Now after a while, especially if you use semi-auto a lot, this cutoff lever will wear down and you'll need to replace it. And let's see, let's show you what the inside of the whole trigger assembly looks like so you can see what the contacts are. This spring that sits under here is what provides the back pressure on the trigger itself. And this spring right here is what keeps the contact slide in the rearward position when you're not pulling the trigger. Now if you happen to break this spring or forget to reattach this spring, or if this little piece here snaps off that way, then the very next time that you pull the trigger, it's going to stay pulled, because this will stay all the way forward if the cutoff lever wasn't in the way. This would stay all the way forward perpetually like that, and the gun would not stop firing. So a lot of times people will reassemble a gearbox and forget this spring, and they'll wonder why their gun just won't stop firing every time they plug it in, and that's usually the reason why. Now in a rear-wired version 2, instead of running out the front here towards the battery, the assembly actually goes up through here in the back and comes out there. Before we take off this wiring harness, let's flip it around and take off this little thing here. This is in some front wired M4s, just kind of keeps the wires going where you want them to. It's not an essential piece. And this is the selector plate, which I should explain. This is the spring that acts on the cutoff lever. When it's in auto position, see, this is where the selector switch, there's a disc on the back of it inside of the lower receiver that pushes this around. So again, safe, you can see that end of the little switch that keeps it safe. Semi is where that is disengaged, but the cutoff lever is still pushing on the sector gear. And then when you bring it all the way back to full, the cutoff lever is angled so that it's not even touching the sector gear. This little plate here also helps with an electrical safety. Now, not all airsoft manufacturers do this. There are some companies that don't have this plate here and don't have these two little metal tabs on the underside of the wiring harness. So they don't actually have an electrical safety. All they have is the physical safety. But since this is a TM clone, it does have that. So what that means is when it's in safe, it's not possible for electricity to even get to the motor because these two contacts aren't touching each other. So if for any reason you have to use a selector plate that's aftermarket that doesn't have one of these metal pieces on it to make that connection, you can actually just solder a little piece of wire between those. It'll just mean that you no longer have an electrical safety, but again, it's just an extra feature. So to take off the selector plate, first thing you want to do is not lose the tiny spring that goes to the cutoff lever. And we're going to pop this out. And we already took the other side of it off earlier. And it's very tight. Bushings falling out here. You notice I'm not paying attention to the bushings falling out or where the shims are because I'm going to re-shim this anyway. But normally if you have something already shimmed and you're taking it apart, you want to keep track of where those little shims are between the bushings and the gears, because if you've already got it perfectly shimmed, you want to keep it that way. Here we'll take off the cutoff lever, which seems to be in pretty good shape. You got, pretty good shape. Got a little bit of wear, but certainly plenty of life left in this cutoff lever. Alright, so now this is the complete wiring harness assembly. And we can slide off the selector plate. And you can see the selector plate. You can see where that was rubbing on those two contacts there. So what I was going to show you about the wiring harness is, this is how it sits in the gun when it's upright. And the contact slide sits in there. And this is what happens when the trigger pushes it forward, is it makes the electrical connection between those two contacts. Now, one of the great things about MOSFETs, and usually the main reason for having them, is that it prevents these from getting burned down over time, because only a tiny amount of electricity actually ends up going through these contacts when you have a MOSFET solid state switch. So it prevents these from being burned down. If you have a gun where you use a battery with a lot of juice, or it has some sort of setup that draws a lot of electricity through these contacts, of course, the sooner they'll burn down, which is why in those setups it's recommended you get a MOSFET. Even in normal setups, though, a MOSFET will essentially mean these will last forever versus having to be replaced after, a few tens of thousands or 100,000 rounds or so. You can see both sides of the shells are not exactly the same. Let me zoom out a bit. Both shells, of course, have grooves for the piston so that it stays centered properly with the teeth meshing with the sector gear. Both sides have the holes for the bushings for each of the gears. They have a little bit of different stuff up top, though. As you can see, the tappet plate runs right in this groove here. And It's a little different on this one. You also have this post here, which is what the spring for the contact slide attaches to, and this post, which is what the spring for the tappet plate attaches to. You've also got where the cutoff lever screws in and where the wiring harness assembly screws in here. And of course you've got this big port here so that the contacts that go to the selector plate can go through there. And that's pretty much it for a tour of exactly what's in a version 2 gearbox and how it works. Again, other version gearboxes have almost all the same parts that function in all the same ways. The only difference is they're shaped a bit differently. But we'll get to those other gearboxes some other time.